Hi there. Well, this is a good topic for me personally, because I just made my way down here from the auto show, the convention center, using a combination of feet, subway, and more feet. But the Hyundai group has some additional options, I think, that are going to be available in the near term to people like myself and residents of LA and other big cities. So why don't we bring our group on up? We have essentially the all-star team from Hyundai's mobility services, the full range of options that would come on up. I'm not looking at everyone's title at the moment. There they are. We have, first of all, let's bring up Adrienne Lindgren, Senior Manager for Global Partnerships with Hyundai UAM, who can talk about what's happening in the air. Dave Gallen, COO with Motionlab here in Los Angeles. And Melika, Jahangiri, Senior Group Manager for the mobility team, who is also living right here in downtown Los Angeles. So first of all, Mel, why don't you help me out here? So as I mentioned, I just got down here using the LA subway system, which works just fine, and my feet from the convention center. But what sort of options do you think you could help me out with going forward here in downtown LA to move around more easily using mobility services from Hyundai?
Absolutely. So I personally have been a carless home in Los Angeles, and I live right above the metro as well. And so I use these services every day. And some of the services that we're looking to branch out to is subscription service, flexible lease services, as well as motion car share, which is another service that is available on the ground that we can use consistently to be able to get around using the metro, as well as using scooters and other types of services within the Hyundai brand. And one day, of course, urban air mobility.
So let's talk a little bit about the subscription model for vehicles, because this is something that a lot of companies have tried and have talked about. You know, it's obviously a different option than conventional lease or purchase to own a vehicle. It seems like it also might be, you know, it's a little more expensive. You know, what is Hyundai's vision for how you make this a compelling product that actually gets some real traction in the market?
Sure. So we initially have been piloting a EV subscription service. You know, we want people to get comfortable with the EV lifestyle in order to essentially want to give up their ICE vehicles and be able to go towards EV adoption by providing a service that's more flexible. We understand that with the pandemic and other things that are going on, people are living more of a nomadic lifestyle. People want to maybe live in Los Angeles for a little bit, maybe New York for a little bit, and having the traditional, you know, living space or vehicle is no longer feasible. And so they want flexibility when they want, how they want. So we have a full in-app service in which people can book, pick up, and drop off their subscription. They can also extend their services for when they need it. And it's a way for people to get exposed to the Hyundai brand that may not traditionally be exposed to it. When they're considering getting an EV, you know, we want people to get comfortable with the Konas or the Ioniqs and other vehicles within Ioniq fleet in order to see how they could adapt to this in their lifestyle, and then hopefully adopt into a Hyundai vehicle that is all electric.
And is the focus going to be primarily or entirely electric vehicles? Are you going to jump over gasoline and go straight to just pure electric?
Well, the initial concept was to get people comfortable with electric vehicles and see how it would fit into their lifestyle every day. It's kind of a try before you buy concept. It's also been another interesting component towards the chip shortage. You know, if somebody is really looking for a specific type of Hyundai vehicle that may not be available in this moment, it's a great gap for them as well. And so they're willing to pay more for that convenience factor because it's all inclusive as well. So it includes maintenance, insurance, and roadside assistance. So with that, you're able to have that convenience factor. And of course, like you mentioned, you'll pay a little bit more for that and having the digital experience. And we work directly with our dealers. They're a partner in this space. And so it's a way for them to be able to have exposure to the brand and hopefully convert to it. But in essence, we are exploring other options within our fleet because it is a way for them to get exposure to the brand, as well as thinking about what it would look like if we were to expose the Genesis brand or other ICE vehicles, but that's further down the line.
So Dave, I guess picking up from there, now talk a little bit about, in the case of Motionlab, how you're also sort of integrating with efforts that the mobility team, Mel's mobility team would be working on.
Absolutely. So Motionlab is a service delivery laboratory for Hyundai here in LA, and we're really focused on LA as our lab. So right now we're offering a motion car share service, which is a free floating car share service operating in Eagle Rock, in downtown, in West LA, and in Warner Center in the West Valley. And the goal of that, along with our Enable LA service, which is a rideshare service for people in wheelchairs or needed assistance door to door, and future things like dynamic shuttling, autonomous vehicles, eventually urban air mobility, are all elements of Hyundai's vision to take people, to help people move around. And I think that's the key here is, unlike some of the other OEMs visions where everything is going to be provided by one OEM, that we don't believe in that. We really believe that Hyundai has an important role to play, but it's about connecting services. So Mel's talking about connecting people through subscription and helping them become comfortable with the technologies of the future. That's a lot of what we're doing as well. We're putting them into hybrids. We're putting them into plug-in hybrids. We'll be putting them into EVs and autonomous vehicles through this service, and building trust and allowing these consumers to experience and experiment with different modes, so they can understand that a multimodal future can actually be significantly easier than just a single mode getting in your car and going.
But on the multimodal front, is Hyundai thinking about, or do you see a need to have like sort of a bike scooter component or something like that, like more of the last mile piece?
So Hyundai's looking at a lot of different elements. I would say the key thing that we are focused on as a service delivery laboratory is understanding what's the platform that can actually provide access to things like car share, things like transit and buses and trains, and things like scooters and bikes, even if they're not owned by Hyundai. So our goal is, be able to reach all of the different consumer groups, whether it be, end consumer or B2B, and provide access to the services that we own and operate, provide access to our public partners and the services they operate, as well as to other private partners. And because that's really how all of those things working together seamlessly is how it's going to end up. And we know that Hyundai can't provide every single step of in that map.
Okay, so now we get to the big one here with Adrienne, because you're working on something that is extremely fascinating, and to someone like myself seems like, I don't know if we're really ready for that. Is that going to happen with the urban air mobility? So we're talking about this sort of new generation of essentially electric helicopters, I guess, that are going to be a little quieter, that can maybe operate a little bit lower, but still it seems like this is going to be very expensive. I mean, how can you make something like that widely accessible, carry high volume? Because we've got a lot of helicopters in Los Angeles today. They're not really hauling a lot of passengers around, but talk a little bit about what is the vision? Why does Hyundai think that this is something the company should get into?
Yeah, so I mean, these are great questions, very valid. So I think I'll try and sort of deconstruct by going line by line, but from the perspective of why are we interested in this particular space, I think one of the things that all of our panelists have expressed here is this interest in looking at diversification within the mobility ecosystem, right? And I think as we think about how we move towards, as an OEM, a global mobility solutions provider, what does that mean? I think some of that is incumbent on us to think about how do we move towards optimization of the mobility ecosystem. And some of that includes, as we've seen sort of with increase in other mobility options, activating different parts of the built environment, in this case, the not built environment in the sky, right, to service the demand. And I think in terms of how we're thinking about integration, we very much, we're a later entry into service vehicle. We're targeting 2028 as when we come to market. And for us, affordability is tied to really two things. One are the cost savings associated with electric vertical takeoff and landing technology, which generally have to do with the power and fuel source, as well as the maintenance, repair, and operations costs, which go down with electrification. I would say the other thing that's very important to us is scale. And scale is going to be deeply tied to the price point. I think we've seen this in a lot of different contexts, right? From your iPhone to what are now going to be these electric helicopters. So the approach that we've really been taking is to, at the same time as we develop an aircraft, develop a very robust ecosystems team that works across the infrastructure, other mobility solutions providers, to understand how do we integrate effectively with public, private transportation services, very much as Dave said, and how do we make sure that there's the right amount of infrastructure available, because we're going to be supply constrained plane from an infrastructure perspective that will allow us to service as many passengers as possible, which brings down the overall price point for each operating, per mile fare, basically. So it's very much, we're trying to move as close as possible to parity with ground transportation. And we really, again, think that's effectively done by integrating across modes, understanding that whatever service that we offer needs to really respect the mobility journey end to end, whether or not those are Hyundai products or something else. And I think critically for us is how we integrate into the existing transit network. How do we use this as a service to drive people into those transit centers and into those transit locations, especially where you have particular gaps. And I think, one thing that's a unique environment, I think sometimes we talk about UAM as a competitive service to things like rail or some of the things on the ground. And they're really fundamentally not only, I think, distinct use cases, but again, you can sort of look at one feeding into another. And I think as long as we continue to think about urban air mobility as a critical value add into the ecosystem, you can end up getting to that scale where you really make the price point most affordable to the most number of people.
So you mentioned 2028 is your target that you're aiming for. And since we're in Los Angeles, are you thinking that this would be a launch city, ahead of the Olympics or in tandem with the Olympics?
Yes.
And tell us a little bit more about what the vision is, because how many passengers likely would you be wanting to carry per trip? If presumably you would want to set up at a place like LAX. So you would be running flights from LAX. Are you going to go to downtown, to Santa Monica, to like high population areas around the city? What does it look like?
Yeah, certainly. I think when you do the sort of we're very focused on demand aggregation, right? Thinking about where people are moving, trying to create infrastructure models that are going to be flexible enough to adapt to how the city changes, right, over the next 7 years. But in general, I think the service model is very much taking from high throughput locations and putting them into either other high throughput locations, right, or servicing routes where there really isn't a very good competitive alternative. For example, there's not enough demand generated in order to get folks into a certain part of the valley where it justifies building a transit system, right? So I think there's both niche use cases. There's also service models that you can think of that are, this is where we get to scale. It's 5 passengers, first with a pilot, then you'll kind of phase out that pilot over time, depending on how, pace of autonomy and regulation. But I sort of think about it as, in some sense, almost like a bus-like service, right? You'll have some amount of scheduled service that, again, we're sort of very focused right now on figuring out, as we work across mobility partners, what exactly is the capacity that we can offer? Where are you getting that modal shift from? But I think a lot of the opportunity comes from servicing areas where you do not have a lot of competitive or particularly attractive transportation options. People are tethered to a car. And again, there's not necessarily a compelling reason to build ground-based infrastructure in order to connect those people to these core urban areas. My dream is very much an LAX Union Station type model. Or as you get you think about people who are coming from the Inland Empire, from the North Valley, right? How do you get them into the metro stations so that they can now freely sort of move about and wherever they want to go, they can pick up a first mile, last mile solution. But forming that first leg of connectivity to get people back into the core transit system.
And in terms of vehicle capacity, like what are you thinking about in terms of how many passengers per vehicle? Because I'm not even sure what we're thinking about. I mean, a helicopter might be 5 to 6.
5.
Yeah. 5.
I know we're looking at 5. I mean, there's other, and I think this is urban air mobility is part of, I think, what you have to call a suite of advanced air mobility solutions, which include, electric regional flight, hydrogen fuel cell based passenger capabilities that I think we're still working out exactly how some of these technologies will work together to service a new aviation network that's, yes, more low altitude, but also is more regionally focused than what you're able to do with current technology. It'll be about 5 for.
I guess the other issue too is cost. I mean, what you mentioned one important point, which is an electric drive is cheaper than an ICE drive, but still aircraft are quite expensive generally. So how could this still be an affordable option for the average person?
Yeah, so I mean, you start with a baseline when you move towards electric distributed propulsion, right? And the associated, I think, don't quote me per se, I want to say about 35% cost savings, right? From where you're at with a helicopter and you bring it down. So there's a couple of functions. Utilization can increase, right? Which brings the overall cost down. There's the fuel systems, right? And sort of that transition that brings the baseline cost down. But this is where I say, there's a lot of conversation about where is the price point really going to fall. And a lot of that really is going to be driven by how fast you can scale the service, which for us is fundamentally an infrastructure question, right? And that's why we have a lot of folks, you'll probably see them wandering around the conference on our partnerships team that's very focused on the off-vehicle systems and ecosystem that has to come together. And how do you utilize as much existing infrastructure, convert that at the lowest cost possible so that your cost control sort of for the infrastructure also becomes a fundamental way to help drive the overall business case down.
I suppose Hyundai is a large scale manufacturer, so it's not building aircraft today, but presumably the company would want to try to utilize some of the high volume manufacturing techniques that applies to cars and trucks to aircraft.
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge that we see, right, in terms of how, when we think about scale, that is one of the things that makes us sort of aligned with the question of how do we get to scale as quickly as possible, right? We see a competitive differentiator in the sense that we have some very, very well sophisticated manufacturing technologies, smart manufacturing technologies, investments in other, robotics, electrification, autonomy, and it's really bringing all of those in-house to create frankly, I won't say a better aircraft, but certainly one that can be produced in mass more quickly. Right now, the amount of aircraft that comes off a line in a given year is pretty low, which also obviously sort of impacts the overall affordability and availability of the aircraft.
Dave, you look like you were wanting to hop in there earlier.
I was just going to say, I think the other piece that Adrienne has touched on a couple times is getting to scale. The important thing is being able to serve as many people as possible. And so that's where having the infrastructure and the ties to different mobility hubs and then seamless trip planning for the end user so that you can understand how and where to connect to ground transportation from air transportation is going to be really critical. So that's where an organization like ours comes in and helps kind of connect all the dots across the different parts. Is how do we help all of these come together? Again, not just the Hyundai pieces, but to, connecting to public transit, connecting to other private services that aren't ours, to make the journey as easy as possible and as accessible as possible, because we know there are going to be different price points for a lot of these different services, and we want to make it as available to as many people as possible, and really with the goal of providing equitable access to all of these services across, not just the west side of LA, but all of Los Angeles.
And you want to make it as seamless as possible as well for the consumer. And so, that's why we're all here on this panel together, because you can't really think of ground without thinking of air, and you can't think about air without thinking about ground. And also Carl also came and did his keynote where we're thinking about autonomous vehicle, but it's all part of the same ecosystem of how we're thinking about our customer and the different customer journey. And there's going to be lots of different customers that are going to be using our products. So some people, EV subscription might be for them, or, car sharing might be for them, or urban air might be for them. There's different ways and we can all connect and bring those services to our consumers and get them exposed to the brand, as well as, having connectivity throughout their day-to-day life. If they use, other types of services, like Dave said, we don't necessarily need to consider doing it all. There's others that are doing it better or have the pool already. We can integrate, and we want to think about how can we better serve the customer.
I wonder, so Hyundai is a massive global company at this point. Are there some lessons or some best practices that you and the company have observed in other markets that might be applicable to a place like Los Angeles? Because this city is, it has its unique challenges, a lot of sprawl. We're still primarily car-based for the most part, trying to transition away from that. But in the near term, that's looking really tough. But I wonder, just thinking through, as Hyundai is developing its mobility strategy beyond just selling someone a car, what are some good examples you think that we might be able to see show up here in Los Angeles that come from other cities?
I would say I look at some European cities. I look at even cities like Pittsburgh, and that have launched new, mobility as a service, kind of broad-based multimodal systems, and they all come from partnerships. And that's really why we're so focused on that, is partnerships with the local, the municipality, the county, the state, as well as federal government, in terms of both the regulatory side, especially for urban air, and the administrative side. Really trying to understand, how do we more effectively meet the needs of the people who live in our area, and all of our systems are set up to be complementary to public transit. for the reason of being able to serve as many people as possible and helping them through that journey. I think that's going to be a really critical piece to this. And then it goes beyond just partnerships, public-private partnerships. It's also private-private partnerships, right? And really trying to figure out who can do this best and how do we pull that dream team together.
A great example of that was when Uber acquired Jump, and then they, integrated into their service, and then realized it was very hard for them to operate a micromobility service. And so they ended up closing down the Jump service, but then they partnered with Lime, and it's part of their app now. So you can book a vehicle for ride hailing, or you can book a vehicle for micromobility sharing. And I think that that's a really interesting and innovative way in which we would also consider partnerships in that capacity. There's also new ride hailing companies that are coming into the market who are thinking about electrification. What does that look like? We think about partnering with them as well, and providing fleets to them, so then the consumer can be exposed to the Hyundai vehicle. And for me, when I first moved to LA and moved to downtown LA, I didn't consider a Hyundai vehicle until I actually used a motion car share service. And I was in it, I used it, and I said, this is a great car, has all the bells and whistles.
Before she worked for Hyundai.
Before I worked for Hyundai. And so I thought about it. I was like, wow, I would totally consider a Hyundai when I wanted to acquire a car for myself. Again, it would be part of my decision making. And, we want to have that same brand exposure to customers in a different capacity, and partnership is one way. And public-private partnerships, of course, is very good. I think Detroit is a great city as well. And you're going to be hearing from Trevor on a panel after us, and they're doing some really interesting stuff. So anywhere that's open to testing and piloting and doing new services is always a great option and partner.
There are a lot of groups around LA who are really interested in this, from neighborhood councils and city council offices to organizations, TMOs like Fastlane DTLA here in downtown, to the California Commission on Transportation. There's so many groups that are so focused on this. I think it's about being able to pull them together and help coordinate those efforts a little bit more effectively. And that's going to be a big part of how we move through this together. Not just Hyundai, not just our groups, but broadly the mobility landscape here in Los Angeles.
Also, I think there's one, and I'll say it's a sort of a best practice you can see from other cities, but also across modes, right? And trying to learn from these different modes that have sort of historically been siloed, like aviation and ground mobility, right? And I think it's placemaking, right? And I think one of the things that we've been very focused on, especially working with some of the ground folks, is as we think about the infrastructure, and we're all sort of, as we have a convergence of different technologies that are supporting a lot of different modes and platform and vehicle platforms, right? I think there's an overlap for what kind of infrastructure is going to be required, of course. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity to think about placemaking around those mobility hubs, right? And some cities have done this really, really effectively already. I think it's something that Los Angeles is taking a much closer look at as they build out their transit network, right? How do we think about these mobility centers and exchange hubs as true activations in communities that have been car centric, that can create more pedestrianism, et cetera. And I also think, if you look at the development of airports, right? I mean, you've seen the Aerotropolis model. You've seen a lot of things pop up around the airport that has made the airport a destination in and of itself, right? Because people spend all the time there. And so I think as you start, I do think placemaking and the sort of relationship between real estate and mobility that is increasingly important is one really interesting best practice that we can all sort of take from both cities and the other different types of modes that have been proliferated.
So in terms of commercialization, urban air mobility is a little further down the line, but I guess based on what you're offering today versus the range of options you think might also be available 2 to 3, 4 years from now, can we talk, spin it forward a bit, from where we are to where you're going?
You want to jump in? All right. A lot of those things will come and go on our platform. I mean, I think that's what the value of being a laboratory is we can try a lot of stuff and it's not all going to work because we're not the mature OEM that needs to be at scale right away. So we get to come in and dabble and learn and apply those learnings to future. So I think that fixed route shuttles, dynamic shuttles, and helping those shuttles maybe connect people to other modes, right? Whether it's taking them to from Lacey, they already have, that's not a bad example, but like from here, Janum to the nearest train station until they have the hub open across the street is a critical element because you may feel comfortable walking to the train station during the day and maybe not at night. So really thinking about what are the elements of safety, what are the elements of service. So beyond car share and access to bike and scooter share, I think integrating with public transit elements, and then offering hopefully, rides with Motional and other autonomous platforms, whether it be, individual vehicle or larger shuttles, I think are definitely things that we can expect in the next, 2 to 3 years.
I think advanced technology is definitely what we're considering and looking at, and how do we better advance our app experience or different technology and modes within that, just like any other OEM is trying to figure out, how do I better create the service that the consumer wants, and how do I adapt to the market changes? So having more of a technology platform that can connect and integrate all of these services and future services, I think it's going to be high priority for Hyundai.
That's certainly for us. I'll say, I think, and Dave and I were talking about this yesterday, future-proofing the infrastructure, which is going to require a lot more connectivity, a lot more energy, right? And to avoid a situation where we're sort of relaying down or, increasing the grid resiliency every 3 years based on new technology coming out, trying to understand what are the requirements going to be in 8 years across multiple platforms, even if we don't know exactly what they are, right? Aircraft is sort of up there in terms of what the requirements are going to be. So trying to, I think, bring the conversation together, especially in the midst of a massive sort of infrastructure bill passing and a lot of upgrades happening with electrification and autonomy. I think figuring out how we integrate these different modes into the same conversation so that infrastructure is future-proofed is one way, I think, to Mel's point, to really focus on those advanced technologies and what is going to be required of them so that we get the ROI, right, as much as we can out of each of those investments.
So I wonder, you're using Los Angeles as sort of a primary laboratory and to test out a lot of these things. When do you really begin to sort of scale within the United States, the US market? Because internationally, presumably Hyundai's doing things in other international markets, but just within North America, what does that roadmap look like?
So the great thing about, again, being a laboratory is that we know that some things won't work, but some things are probably going to take off beyond our wildest imagination. So when that happens, those things will actually spin out of our lab, so we can stay focused on being a laboratory and not operate at scale. And it will spin out into, organizations that will operate on their own. And so, we'll create a new affiliate that is just focused on that one particular service. And I think that was the genius part of how Hyundai set up Motionlab, is let us play in the sandbox and figure out what does work and what doesn't work, pass those learnings, not only keep those in-house to the services we're offering, but pass those learnings across the whole Hyundai family. So it can be applied not just here in the US, but really globally. So I think really a great model for any municipality or any organization looking to experiment with these things is not all of your eggs in one basket, right? And really be able to have the expectation that you're going to do short pilots and you're going to learn from them, and you're going to turn, inward again and figure out how to apply those learnings most effectively, and then come out with, version 2 or some kind of beta that's a pivot away from that because of what you've learned.
So, I think we definitely have found, Los Angeles is a very dynamic environment, right? I think there is, I don't want to say feeling that if you can make it happen in Los Angeles, it's a pretty complicated place to make it work. And I think we feel like there's an exportability of what you do here, right? That in terms of best practices, but also I think we've seen a lot of great leadership from the city, from Metro, from a lot of the different cities within the county to lean into partnerships. And I think we're also trying to figure out what those models are for the right types of partnerships that get us to the right place. And I think we look at this similarly as sort of that living lab and the sort of validating space in which we seek to build the business model. We've definitely engaged with, Canadian Advanced Air Mobility. We're in the UK Future Flight Challenge. So we're trying to work across multiple geographies, bring those geographies together, right? And really lean into the leadership of the agencies, the public officials, and the leaders here that are having those discourse, and make sure we're at the table and being a productive partner that we can help share the wealth and reduce the capacity burden on each city to try and to adjust to every new technology that comes online.
Well, Hyundai's obviously not alone, among global OEMs that want to provide a range of new services. So I wonder, what do you think sets Hyundai apart from, say, General Motors or Ford or VW or Toyota that have their own sort of competing mobility efforts? I mean, is there something that you think you're doing that maybe the others aren't doing, or that you're doing better?
Well, at Hyundai, we are always thinking about the consumer, and we have this vision of progress for humanity. So everything kind of rolls into that vision of how do we kind of improve humanity, not only for our customers, but for the world at large. And so, we've dedicated $7.4 billion to infrastructure and electrification in North America.
7.4 billion.
That's correct.
Just for North America.
That's correct. And our PR is here. If I said anything incorrectly, please. They're shaking their head that it is correct. Yes. So we are dedicated to creating the infrastructure to help support these progresses in the future. And also, how do we think about different ways of modes? Like, we have commercial vehicles, we have traditional vehicles, we have urban air mobility, we have car sharing and different mobility services. So we're trying to think about how do we create this mobility lifestyle? It's not just how do I get you from A to B, or how do I sell you this car and make it very transactional, but trying to make it very much a relationship that you have with Hyundai. And it doesn't necessarily mean just when you get into our vehicle or purchase a vehicle, but other ways in which you use our services. And that could also be part of the technology piece as well. I mean, we might even in the future be a technology provider that will provide technology to a city to create these services themselves, or we might partner with them to help create these services and provide the vehicles. There's different ways in which we can think about how we want to be innovative.
Yeah, to build on what Mel said, I think it comes back to Hyundai's vision and how they think about their business model, which is it's always customer first. It's a customer centric model, and we work backwards to what we can provide from that. And so really understanding that, change is hard. Change is hard, obviously, on our side, but it's really hard for somebody who's used to doing something to change their behaviors and models. And so giving them options, not always asking them just to buy a new car because of new technology is out, but allow them to experiment with that through subscription services, through other mobility services, allowing them to get a taste of it and understand how it fits into their life, and that, oh, this might actually be not just a little incrementally better than driving my own car, but significantly better for the things that I care about, whether that be reducing your carbon footprint or reducing your time of travel, or as we come out of COVID, maybe actually seeing more people and interacting with them on a more regular basis. So getting out of that single vehicle box, and that learning from the customer and being able to incorporate all of those things, both in the product and the services that are developed, I think is a really key and integral part of Hyundai's success and what will make them successful going forward.
And so I'll say, from even just my own personal experience, I was definitely drawn to Hyundai because I feel like we get a lot of license to also look at these off-vehicle systems and ecosystem that needs to be brought together. And I think, if you want to talk about the aircraft market in general, I think you've probably seen a bit of an imbalance, right, between how much money is being invested into the aircraft, right, and then what's going to have to go into actually getting the right takeoff and landing pads, everything else kind of orchestrated. And I think we've been given a lot of license to go out and build those proactive partnerships and invest in the cities that we want to be in and we want to serve, and really lean into sort of that public-private model, which I do think is a very different attitude, and that I've certainly appreciated. We've got a relatively long planning horizon for urban air mobility, and it's pretty rare that you get given a planning horizon of any kind. And so that's been, for me, that's been a great aspect of sort of being within this space.
And I guess also, Hyundai is a company, it's a business, it's not a charity. So how do these services pencil out at the end of the day? I mean, can they be profitable? Is anyone making money from pure mobility services?
So I think that the key there is I think any single mobility service, it's difficult. But I think when you can offer a suite of services and provide and allow those services to connect seamlessly to public transit and other modes, that's where the value is created for the customer. And when value is created for the customer, that's what's going to flow to the organization. So I'd say in this early experimental phase, it's harder to be highly profitable with any one service. But I think that, and this is what I've been impressed with Hyundai's vision on this, is they're working for that longer term future. and they know that there's an investment that's required before you get there.
I was just going to agree with you on that. I mean, whenever you're doing any kind of new service and mobility service, there's going to be some fixed costs, et cetera. But you're trying to get your brand exposure out there, and you're also trying to get different mobility services to your dealers to get them up to speed with what's going on in the marketplace and, you know, the changing consumer. And so we are investing in our dealers and also our consumers and kind of the future thinking of where things are going. And so, you know, we're working towards profitability. Of course, our CEO, Jose Munoz, is very much, you know, wanting things to be profitable for us. And so we're always considering that in everything that we do. But in the beginning, it's always experimental, and we're trying to see how does the customer respond to this, and how do we kind of adapt to what the customer needs and also where the market is going.
When you think you have sort of the right combination of services, sort of the right suite of mobility services, you're experimenting in LA, but within North America, is this something that you literally can roll out and replicate everywhere rapidly, or do you need to take time to tailor it to individual cities? Because Chicago, New York, Boston, San Francisco, Oakland, LA, these are you know, all very different, and one size may not fit all.
You are absolutely correct. So every, you know, new market has their own requirements and regulations, and, you know, you have to spend a lot of time going through the legality of operating in that market, you know, the appetite of the cities operating in that market, the consumer, et cetera. You know, insurance is a factor, maintenance is a factor, all these things, you know, vendors are a factor. So you have to really kind of go by sequence and see where it makes sense for us to grow and expand and where the consumer is. And also, you know, what is it that the brand wants to do and where do we want to get the most exposure out of that?
I want to open this up to audience questions momentarily, but a couple quick ones, Adrienne, just to sort of wrap up on urban air mobility. One of the things I wanted to be clear on, when you're thinking about setting up where you'll be operating the service for takeoff and landing, is this the kind of thing that you can just work with, like a parking garage, for example? Like, you know, this type of aircraft, you don't really need special facilities. You just need like a big X on top of a roof of a parking facility.
There are a lot of different ranges and visions of what can be delivered as part of the infrastructure for urban air mobility. And some look more expensive and some are more affordable. And some of that depends on whether or not or what level of infrastructure you're adapting. We have been exploring a lot of different options for how this comes together at sort of all of the different price points. We've also explored modularity of the infrastructure, right? So that we can be nimble, and as sort of polynodal cities change, right, we can pick it up as we move it. So yes, I mean, you can get some very simplistic infrastructure. I think the thing that probably is, and I saw this with, you know, fleet electrification when I was doing that kind of work, with, you know, buses and ground fleets. The energy costs are high, can be highly variable, right? So there's, I think, the piece that is the most difficult to predict on a site-to-site basis, and to sort of that creates, again, sort of the most cost variability of the infrastructure is going to be what already exists there and what is it going to take to retrofit. And then I would say the other one is accessibility. So how accessible is that structure? So parking structures, right, often have an access point that's already pre-designed to give public access or to user access. There are other facilities that are higher target, where that, you know, some folks targeting high-rise buildings and office structures, for example. That's going to be a very different model. You may actually have an easier time building some of it on top of for retrofitting helipad, et cetera. But now you have an access challenge that you have to sort of address. How are you going to get people up there if they're not part of the buildings, companies, et cetera? So I think our team has a perspective that you can do this pretty affordably, but that there is a cost variability around the energy. And we're working across a number of different groups and organizations, you know, both locally and federally, trying to figure out how do you also inventory where the grid is at, where is the planning going from an infrastructure perspective based on current and future projected demand for ground-based vehicles, and how do you dovetail nicely? And that's why I say, like, maximizing the investment in other forms of electrification, autonomy, the digital network, which are going to be very, very critical for aircraft services, is going to help us control the cost from an infrastructure perspective.
Do we have any audience questions? We have some mics here, or if you want to shout it out nice and loud.
what you're. Yeah, so I'm very intrigued in what you're going to be delivering. And I've got no doubt you'll do a good job. So one of the things I'm very excited about with Hyundai is your focus on hydrogen, and you talked about aggregating demand and partnerships. Does that feature here in LA? I know it's a big thing in Korea, but is that part of your plans?
It's part of our plans, not specifically in Los Angeles, but it's part of our overall North America plans. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think hydrogen is an interesting model. I think that where we struggle here is a little bit around the infrastructure elements. And in my neighborhood, 3 years ago, there were 5 stations nearby, and now there are 2. So I think it's going to take that public-private partnership to understand how to develop the infrastructure to support the new technologies, whether that be hydrogen EV or something that's not yet developed.
Just probably say from my end, I think diversifying, we're talking about a large scale conversion of a lot of different modes, right, to zero emissions. I think we need to reframe some of the conversation around how hydrogen, electricity, how these different forms of alternative energy, right, come together to deliver on what we're going to need going forward. And I think that's an area where we're all positioned because we have some great investments already going in hydrogen. But to Dave's point, figuring out some of the politics and also the infrastructure around it is probably the $600 question.
I'm really happy that you love the Kona EV because it is a very great car. And I think once you experience it, you're going to have that reaction. And that's why we created EV subscription, so that people experience it and have a similar reaction that you did.
Thank you.
In front here.
Hi there, Dan Saunders from SETI Paper Mile Finance. Thank you for the insight you've given today and your vision for mobility as a service. Can I just ask, are you expecting to own and operate the assets, the vehicles, the infrastructure, or are you looking for a vision whereby you combine with partners, you outsource, you work with fleet operators? What's the vision there?
Yes. The answer to both, I think in some cases it will make a lot of sense for us to own and operate, and in other cases it won't. And in some cases, even for car share, for instance, we own and operate all of our vehicles now, but we've been approached by others who want to actually buy the vehicles because they want to get the tax credits for the EVs, but they want to install our technology and run the service. And there's actually a huge variety of different ways we can do that. And so I think building the technology such that it's flexible enough to meet all of those needs is going to be really important. So I think that in some cases it will make a lot of sense for us to own and operate. And in other cases it will be about connecting with those who actually want to have to own some element of it, whether they own the vehicle or they own the vehicle servicing or whatever.
And sorry, just to follow on then, is that the same principles then that would act for air mobility? Would you see the same thing happening again there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's demand on the Hyundai side for owning and operating to some extent, especially because we do have so many other mobility services that require overlapping infrastructure. That said, we're taking a fairly proactive approach and thinking about what do we do well, and where does that contribute to the overall business model, and where can we have those partnerships, whether they're internal to Hyundai or external to Hyundai, and integrate, lean into what people do well, right? And again, since we're very focused and laser focused on this concept of affordability, I think, again, there's a lot of things that we bring to the table from Hyundai's general sort of investment portfolio and portfolio of companies that help us bring down those price points. But I think it's really going to come down to figuring out exactly how you get to both profitability for the partners, but also leaning into what we don't necessarily always do well, and where we can really make strategic partnerships that help us get to universal affordable accessibility.
And I think just to touch on Dave's point, there's going to be times where we're going to have a technology that maybe we want to license and we don't want to necessarily operate, but we can help others operate those kinds of services and help to grow and expand. We're seeing that trend also in other OEMs, and it's something that Hyundai is looking into as well.
Thank you.
If we don't have any other audience questions at the moment, I have a couple more quick ones to sort of wrap up. And I want to continue on with the hydrogen question, because one of the things I've been writing about a lot is hydrogen coming for heavy vehicles, and Hyundai is obviously one of the big players in that movement. For the UAM, for urban air mobility, is it fair to assume that the product that will come out by the end of this decade is probably going to be hydrogen fuel cell? Because the discussion around batteries, they work great for like a Kona or a small car around town. The weight in the air is a whole different issue. And you know, you have to consider every pound that's going up there. So for your vehicle, are you developing like a hydrogen fuel cell system?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a complicated dynamic for a couple of reasons. I'll just say with aviation, transportation of hydrogen, there are some challenges around hydrogen and aviation, but it's very much an area where we are looking from the aircraft side to say, how can we take those investments in hydrogen and how do we increase the range, the capacity, the payload of the aircraft? We see this definitely as an opportunity space where those investments in hydrogen can potentially be quite helpful. There's certain things I'm not totally sure I can talk about, so I will say here, but yes, we're very, very interested and investigating the relationship between how do we also think about generations of vehicles and the adaptability of your vehicles as we move from battery to hydrogen and as the hydrogen infrastructure catches up and some of the regulation catches up.
And then finally, the last question would be, you know, the previous panel, we have Motional talking about autonomy. One of the things we didn't really focus on is, are these going to be autonomous aircraft to sort of maximize cost and efficiency?
Yeah, so I think, you know, autonomy is another one of those things I'll just say for UAM that is going to be heavily tied to regulation and the pace of regulation and consumer adoption. Obviously, one of the benefits of having autonomy rolling out on the ground, first is socialization of autonomy, right, with people. I think though for aviation, there's a real there's a firm regulatory challenge with how we sort of have to get from A to B. So we'll probably, you know, we will have pilots in those vehicles. They will eventually be phased out, but the pacing is a little bit challenging to say exactly when. I would also just say, I think the other, you know, aspect of autonomy is with aviation, a lot more of your current flights are way more automated than we think, right? So I think we talk about autonomy in aviation as something that is potentially really kind of scary, or it's intense, it feels a bit different, but it's a very critical function of the aircraft that you use today. And so I think it's again, sort of just addressing some of the technicalities and the way that we approach the regulatory environment to get to those fully autonomous systems.
So you're gonna put a locked cabin at the front so nobody can see?
TBD.
All right, well, panel, thank you very much, and thank you for your attention. Enjoy the remainder of CoMotion.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.